It was one of those warm afternoons when the city moved at its usual pace. People walking with shopping bags, traffic lights blinking lazily, and a faint smell of coffee from the cafe near the corner. Inside the Bright Mart superstore, everything seemed normal until the sound of an alarm cut through the hum of chatter. A few customers turned to look. The store manager, a short man with a clipboard in his hand, rushed toward the exit where a woman stood, holding a reusable shopping bag. She wasn't running. She wasn't panicking. She just stood there, confused. As the security alarm kept beeping, the manager pointed at her and shouted that she hadn't paid for some of the items in her bag. The woman tried to explain something, but the words were drowned out by the noise and attention building around her. A few people began taking out their phones, recording the scene. Within minutes, 2 uniformed police officers entered the store. One of them, a tall man with a calm voice, asked what was going on. The manager eagerly explained that he had caught a shoplifter red-handed. He claimed she tried to leave the store without paying. The woman looked at the officers and spoke softly, saying she had paid for most of her items but had stepped outside for a moment to grab her wallet from the car because she had forgotten it inside. Her explanation didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like something that could easily happen to anyone. But still, rules were rules. The officers asked her for identification. She hesitated, her eyes showing a mix of worry and disbelief. She said her ID was in her wallet, which was in her car parked just outside. One officer looked at his partner and sighed. It wasn't unusual for people to say that when they were trying to get out of trouble. The manager kept insisting that she had tried to steal and demanded immediate action. Crowds had started forming near the checkout area. People whispered. Others pretended not to look, but couldn't help watching. The woman stood quietly, her posture straight, her voice calm. She didn't cry or argue, which made the officers unsure about her. Most people in her situation would be shouting or defending themselves, but she seemed oddly composed. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to come with us," one officer said. She nodded. There was no fight, no struggle. She just handed over her bag and walked beside them. The manager looked satisfied, as if justice had been served. The woman, on the other hand, looked like she was thinking about something far more serious than a misunderstanding. Outside, the afternoon sun glared against the pavement. The officers opened the patrol car door, and as she stepped inside, she quietly said, "This is going to be an interesting day." At the station, things followed the usual pattern. The officers filled out forms, logged the items, and began processing her case. They spoke to her politely but kept their professional distance. She didn't speak much, just asked once if she could make a phone call. The officer told her she could after they finished the booking procedure. She nodded and sat down quietly. There was something about her presence that made the younger officer uneasy. It wasn't fear, it was something like respect, though he couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was the way she carried herself. Even sitting on that metal chair, she looked composed, confident, like someone used to being in control. Meanwhile, back at the store, the manager was reviewing security footage to back up his claim. The store's cameras were old and sometimes glitched. This time, too, the recording had gaps. It showed her scanning a few items, then bending down to pick up her bag. But before she reached the exit, the screen went blank for a few seconds and then came back showing her outside. It wasn't clear whether she had walked out without paying or if the register had simply failed to record the final transaction. The store clerk scratched his head. Something didn't add up. Still, he sent the incomplete footage to the station as evidence. The officers there watched it and exchanged puzzled looks. It wasn't enough to prove she had stolen anything, but it wasn't enough to clear her either. The case was stuck in that gray area between suspicion and truth. The woman sat silently, glancing occasionally at the clock. She didn't seem nervous about the outcome, which made one of the officers curious. He asked her where she worked. She smiled faintly and said, "You'll find out soon enough." Her tone wasn't arrogant, it was calm, almost gentle. Hours passed. Paperwork was piling up, phones rang, and the station moved with its usual rhythm. Then the door to the office opened, and the station supervisor walked in. He looked around and froze when his eyes landed on the woman sitting in the corner. His expression changed instantly, from confusion to alarm. Without saying a word, he motioned for one of the officers to come closer. They stepped aside and spoke in hushed tones. The young officer frowned, confused. The supervisor whispered sharply, "Do you have any idea who that is?" The officer shook his head. The supervisor took a deep breath and said, "That woman is the new deputy chief. She was scheduled to visit next week for an internal evaluation." The color drained from the officer's face. He turned slowly to look at her, sitting quietly, still waiting. The realization hit him like a wave. They had arrested their new boss, the same person who would be reviewing their department's performance. The supervisor hurried over to her, his voice trembling slightly as he said, "Ma'am, I am terribly sorry for this misunderstanding." She looked up, her expression unreadable, and replied softly, "I see you've been busy." The room went silent. Every officer nearby stopped what they were doing. The sound of typing, phones, and chatter faded. Everyone watched as the supervisor apologized repeatedly. The woman stood up, calm as ever, and said, "I'd like to review your procedures when you have a moment." No one dared to speak. The two officers who had arrested her felt like the ground had disappeared beneath them. They had followed the rules, yes, but the thought that they had handcuffed their own deputy chief made their stomachs twist. She didn't scold them, didn't raise her voice. She simply asked for her belongings and quietly left the room. After she left, the supervisor sighed heavily and turned to the two officers. "You two better hope she's as understanding as she seems," he said. The officers sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. One of them said, "She didn't even look angry." The other replied, "That's what scares me." Outside, the woman walked to her car, the sun already beginning to set. She took a deep breath before getting in, then looked at the building for a moment. Her reflection in the car window showed a small, knowing smile. The day hadn't gone as planned. She had come to observe the department next week, but fate had given her a first-hand look at how her team handled real-life situations. As she started the car, she murmured to herself, "Maybe this is exactly what I needed to see." And with that, she drove away, leaving behind a station full of stunned officers who had no idea what the next few days would bring. The next morning, the police station buzzed with uneasy energy. No one could focus. Every officer knew what had happened the day before, and no one could believe it. The woman they had arrested for shoplifting wasn't just anyone. She was their new deputy chief, the one everyone had been talking about for weeks. Rumors had been going around about her strict but fair leadership style, and now the entire department had met her in the most unexpected way possible. The two officers who had made the arrest sat quietly at their desks. They hadn't slept much. The whole thing replayed in their minds again and again. The flashing lights, the handcuffs, her calm voice. They didn't mean to do anything wrong. They followed procedure, but now it felt like their careers were hanging by a thread. The station supervisor walked in holding a thick file and told everyone to focus on their work, but even he couldn't hide his nervousness. He had received an email early that morning from the deputy chief herself. It was short and polite, saying she would visit later that day to discuss the matter. That line, "to discuss the matter," was enough to make the entire staff uneasy. By noon, the sound of heels clicked down the hallway. The woman entered, the room wearing a dark suit, her posture straight, her face calm. Everyone stood up out of respect, though some tried not to meet her eyes. She smiled faintly, not out of friendliness but out of professionalism. She looked at the two officers who had arrested her and said, "Let's talk." They followed her into the conference room. The air inside felt heavy. She gestured for them to sit. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then she looked at them and said, "You both did your job yesterday." The officers looked confused. She continued, "You saw something that looked wrong. You followed procedure, and you acted. That's what you were trained to do. I respect that." Relief began to creep into their faces, but before they could say anything, she added, "However, there's something you both need to learn, and it's not written in the manual." She paused for a moment and looked at them carefully. "Sometimes following the rule book isn't enough. Sometimes you need to stop and look at the person in front of you, their behavior, their words, their body language. If you had listened closely yesterday, you might have realized that the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. The room was silent. The officers nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. She wasn't angry. She was teaching them. Then she leaned back slightly and said, "When I walked into that store, I didn't expect to be arrested. I went in to buy a few things on my way home. I left my wallet in the car, and when I stepped out to get it, the alarm went off. The store manager didn't ask question, he assumed. And you both followed his words instead of using your own judgment." One of the officers swallowed hard. "Ma'am, we truly didn't know." "We're sorry," she nodded. "I know you didn't, but this is exactly what I want to change. Our department needs to learn the difference between reacting and understanding." The meeting continued for almost an hour. She didn't scold them once. She spoke about respect, observation, and communication, the things that separate good officers from great ones. By the end, the officers felt more relieved than embarrassed. She told them she wasn't going to file any complaint, and that what happened would remain between them. But she did have one condition. "I want you both to be part of the new training program I'm starting," she said. "Real-life case studies. Real lessons." Not from books, they agreed instantly. They could hardly believe how forgiving she was. But deep down, they knew this moment would stay with them forever. After the meeting, she walked through the main office, speaking to other officers, asking about their work, their cases, and their opinions on how to improve things. She wasn't distant like some higher-ups. She listened carefully, nodded often, and made people feel heard. The tension that filled the building slowly began to fade. By the afternoon, word spread that the deputy chief wasn't angry at all. In fact, she had called the arrest a blessing in disguise. Everyone was shocked, but in a good way. It was rare for someone in her position to handle something like that with such calm and grace. Later that day, she visited the Bright Mart superstore. The same manager who had called the police was there, nervously waiting near the counter. The moment he saw her, his face turned pale. He started apologizing before she could even say a word. She stopped him gently and said, "I'm not here for that. I just want to talk." He looked surprised. She walked with him to his office at the back of the store. "I understand you were doing your job," she said. "But next time, before you accuse someone, make sure you have all the facts. People's reputations can be damaged in seconds." The manager nodded, ashamed but thankful for her understanding. Before leaving, she told him to make sure his staff got proper training on how to handle similar situations. "It's not about punishment," she said. "It's about learning." When she walked out of the store, she noticed a few people recognizing her. Some had been there the day before, watching when she was taken away. Now those same people whispered to each other, surprised to see her standing confidently, not as a suspect but as a leader. That evening, she drove home in silence, thinking about everything that had happened. She didn't hold any grudge against the officers or the manager. In a strange way, the experience had shown her something she needed to see. How ordinary people react under pressure. How quickly judgment replaces understanding. It reminded her why she had taken the job in the first place. To bring change from within. At home, she made a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city lights flickered in the distance. Her phone buzzed with a message from the station supervisor. It said, "Thank you for today. The team really learned something." She smiled at the screen and replied, "That's the goal." The next day, the department held a small meeting in the break room. Everyone was still talking about what had happened. The two officers stood in front of their team and shared what the deputy chief had told them. They admitted their mistake but explained the lessons they had learned. Their honesty impressed their colleagues. From that day on, things began to change inside the department. The deputy chief introduced new procedures, ones that focused not just on enforcing the law but on understanding people. She encouraged officers to ask questions before making assumptions, to stay calm under pressure, and to see every citizen as a human being, not just a suspect. Weeks passed, and the story of that strange day faded from gossip, replaced by respect. People began to admire her not only for her position, but for her composure and fairness. She earned trust, not through authority but through empathy. The two officers who had once felt embarrassed were now often the first to volunteer for community work. They helped organize open forums where citizens could share their concerns directly with the police. They even started visiting schools, teaching students about safety and communication. One afternoon, the deputy chief walked into the training room where the two officers were speaking to a group of new recruits. They paused and greeted her. She listened quietly as they told the story, not as a tale of shame, but as a lesson about humility and growth. When they finished, she smiled and said, "The best officers aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who learn from them." Everyone in the room nodded. The story that had started with embarrassment had turned into inspiration. As the day ended, she stood in her office, looking out at the sunset, reflecting off the city skyline. The same city where, not long ago, she had been handcuffed in front of strangers. Now she led the very people who once didn't recognize her. Life had a strange way of teaching lessons, she thought. Sometimes the most humbling experiences turn into the most powerful ones. And deep down, she was grateful for that unexpected day at the store, because it had shown her something she might never have seen otherwise. That true leadership isn't about power or position. It's about patience, understanding, and the ability to turn mistakes into lessons for everyone. Days turned into weeks, and the story of the mistaken arrest slowly became something of a quiet legend inside the police department. Everyone had heard it, but no one spoke about it directly. It had changed the way people worked, the way they treated others, and the way they thought about their own roles. The deputy chief had become more than a leader. She had become a symbol of calm authority, someone who led with understanding instead of fear. One morning, she arrived at the department earlier than usual. The city was just waking up, the sky painted with soft shades of orange and gold. She walked through the nearly empty hallways, her heels clicking against the floor, carrying a folder filled with notes for the new community outreach program she had been planning. The two officers who had once arrested her were now part of her core team. They had changed a lot, more thoughtful, more observant, more patient. They often shared small insights that helped shape her new ideas. That morning, she called a meeting with her team. When everyone had gathered, she began by saying, "You all know what happened a few weeks ago. I don't want anyone to forget that day, not because of what went wrong, but because of what it taught us." The room fell silent, each person remembering their own version of the story. She went on, "That incident showed me something very important. It reminded me that mistakes aren't always failures. Sometimes they're the start of something better." She smiled softly and the team nodded. There was no tension in the room anymore, only respect. After the meeting, the deputy chief and her two officers went out for coffee. The streets were busy, people rushing to work, buses passing by, vendors opening their stalls. It was an ordinary morning, but there was something peaceful about it. As they sat outside the small cafe, one of the officers said, "You know, I used to think being a cop was just about following the law. Now I see it's also about understanding why people make mistakes." She nodded. "That's the heart of it. People aren't perfect. Neither are we. But if we handle situations with patience, we can make a real difference." Their conversation was interrupted by a call over the radio. A small disturbance had been reported near the Old Town Market. It wasn't serious, but she decided to go along with them. "Let's take a look," she said. When they arrived, a small crowd had gathered around a street vendor and a teenage boy. The vendor was angry, shouting that the boy had taken something without paying. The boy, with tears in his eyes, kept saying he didn't mean to. The situation was tense, familiar even. The deputy chief watched quietly as her two officers approached. This time, things went differently. Instead of jumping to conclusions, they calmed the vendor first, then spoke gently to the boy. They learned he was hungry and had taken a piece of fruit because he hadn't eaten since the previous night. The vendor's anger softened as he realized the boy wasn't a thief, just desperate. One of the officers paid for the fruit and the boy thanked them quietly, eyes downcast. The deputy chief watched the entire scene unfold, proud but silent. She didn't need to step in. Her team had learned. On the drive back, she said, "That's exactly what I hope to see. Compassion before action." The officers smiled, feeling a quiet sense of pride. Back at the station, she began preparing for a presentation she was scheduled to give at the city's annual law enforcement summit. The topic was modern policing and human understanding. She wanted to share her experience, and not to embarrass anyone, but to show how easily perception can twist reality. When the day of the summit came, the auditorium was filled with officers from across the city. As she stood at the podium, the lights dimmed slightly. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Several weeks ago," she said, "I was arrested by my own team." The audience went completely silent. Some officers looked at each other, unsure if they had heard correctly. "Yes," she continued with a faint smile, "I was mistaken for a shoplifter. It wasn't pleasant, but it was one of the most valuable experiences of my career." She explained what had happened, step by step, not leaving out any detail. How she forgot her wallet, how the alarm went off, how assumptions took over. She didn't name the officers or the store, but she emphasized the lesson. "That day taught me that judgment can cloud our thinking faster than we realize. It showed me that even the most well-intentioned officers can make mistakes if they stop seeing people as individuals and start seeing them as cases." Her words carried weight, not because they came from authority, but because they came from honesty. The audience listened closely. She continued, "We can't change the fact that people make errors. What we can change is how we respond to them. Empathy doesn't make you weak. It makes you wiser." By the time she finished, the entire room stood up in applause. Some officers even had tears in their eyes. The story spread beyond the summit. News outlets covered it, calling her the chief who turned humiliation into hope. But to her, it wasn't about the attention. It was about the message. In the days that followed, departments from nearby towns reached out to her for guidance. She started hosting workshops on community trust and moral decision-making. The two officers who had once arrested her were now helping lead these sessions. They spoke about how they had felt that day, how certain they were that they were doing the right thing, and how shocked they were to find out who she really was. Their openness made others reflect on their own biases. One evening after a long workshop, she sat in her office alone. The lights were dim, and the hum of the city outside was faint. She looked at a photo on her desk, a picture of the department taken years ago, long before she joined. So much had changed since then. She picked up her pen and began to write notes for the next training program. She wrote, "Every officer must remember, the uniform gives us authority, but it doesn't give us the right to assume. Look beyond actions. Understand intentions." She underlined those words twice. Just as she was finishing, there was a knock at her door. It was one of the officers. "Ma'am," he said, "we wanted to thank you again. If that day hadn't happened, we wouldn't have learned half of what we know now." She smiled warmly. "Then it was worth it." Before leaving, he added quietly, "That boy at the market, he came by earlier. He brought a thank you note." He handed her a folded piece of paper. Inside, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for seeing me, not judging me." She stared at the note for a long moment. It was simple, but it carried more meaning than most reports she had ever read. When she left the office that night, the sky was full of stars. The streets were quiet except for the soft hum of cars passing in the distance. She walked to her car slowly, feeling a mix of peace and gratitude. Life had taken her through an unexpected lesson, but it had shaped not only her career, it had shaped her as a person. As she drove home, she thought about how quickly people form opinions, how easily misunderstanding can become conflict. But she also thought about how simple kindness can change everything. The incident at the store had started as a mistake, but it had turned into a bridge, connecting officers to citizens, rules to reason, and law to humanity. That night, before going to bed, she stood by her window again, looking out over the city she served. The light shimmered across the skyline. Somewhere out there, people were still making mistakes, still learning, still trying. And she realized that's what made her work meaningful. Not perfection, but progress. She whispered to herself, "We're all human. That's what keeps us learning." Then she smiled softly, turned off the light, and let the quiet of the night settle in, knowing tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new chances to lead with heart. Months had passed since that unforgettable day when the deputy chief was mistaken for a shoplifter. The city had changed in subtle ways. The police department, once tense and mechanical, now carried a more human rhythm. Officers greeted people with genuine warmth, not forced smiles. The two officers who had made the mistake that started it all were now among the most respected in the department. They had become living examples of how humility could transform a person. The deputy chief continued her work quietly, always focusing on what mattered most: building trust. She spent more time out in the community than behind her desk. People recognized her now, not because of her position but because of how she treated them. Children waved when they saw her car pass by. Store owners often came out to thank her for listening when no one else did. One chilly morning, she arrived at the station earlier than usual. The sky was gray and a soft drizzle tapped against the windows. She had been working late the night before, reviewing new training materials. The idea was to create a program that would help officers handle emotional or confusing situations with more care, something that could prevent others from going through what she had. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. The city looked quiet, almost sleepy. Her thoughts drifted back to that day in the store. How quickly things had gone wrong, how easily she could have been treated like a criminal without a chance to explain. That experience had changed her deeply. It had stripped away pride and replaced it with empathy. Just then, one of the younger officers knocked on her door. He looked nervous. "Ma'am, there's someone here asking to see you," he said. She turned. "Who is it?" He didn't give his name. Says you might remember him. Curious, she followed the officer to the lobby. There, standing by the door, was the same teenage boy from the market, the one who had once been accused of stealing fruit. He looked different now. Cleaner clothes, better posture, but still the same nervous eyes. He smiled when he saw her. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said softly. "You probably don't remember me." "I do," she said. "You were at the market that day." He nodded. "I got a job now. At that same market. The man who owned the stall. He hired me after that day. Said he learned something too." Her smile widened. "That's wonderful to hear. I'm proud of you." He hesitated before speaking again. "I just wanted to tell you. That day changed my life. You didn't know me, but you saw me differently. I'll never forget that." Those words stayed with her long after he left. It reminded her why she had chosen this path, why she believed so deeply in the power of understanding. People could change, situations could change, but kindness always left a mark. Later that day, she called for a department-wide meeting. Everyone gathered in the main hall, curious about what it was for. She stood at the front, her presence calm yet commanding. "I want to share something important," she began. "In our line of work, we see people at their worst. Scared, angry, desperate. But if we look closely, we'll also see something else, the chance to make things better. Every person we meet gives us that chance." She spoke slowly, letting every word sink in. "A few months ago, I learned that lesson the hard way. I was on the other side of what we do. And that experience changed me. I realized how easy it is to lose sight of humanity when we focus only on rules." No one said a word, but the room was filled with quiet reflection. The officers who had arrested her looked down, remembering how they had felt that day. The shock, the guilt, and eventually, the lesson. She went on. "Our job isn't just to enforce laws. It's to protect people, even from misunderstanding, even from themselves sometimes. That's what true service means." By the end of her speech, a sense of pride and purpose filled the room. People clapped, not out of duty, but from respect. Over the following weeks, her new training program officially began. She called it Listen First. It was built around real stories, not statistics or theories, and focused on one thing: learning to pause before judging. The officers who went through it came out more aware, more grounded. The department's complaints dropped, and citizens began noticing the difference. One afternoon, she was invited to a local radio station to talk about the program. The host asked her what inspired it. She paused for a moment and said, "A mistake. One that became a blessing. Sometimes life teaches you the hardest lessons in the most unexpected ways." Listeners called in to share their thoughts. One woman said her brother had been treated unfairly once, and she wished someone like the deputy chief had been there. Another caller, a retired officer, said her story reminded him of why he joined the force decades ago: to serve, not to judge. After the interview, as she left the studio, an older man waiting outside approached her. "You don't know me," he said, "but I just wanted to shake your hand. The city's better because of what you did." She thanked him quietly and walked to her car, her heart full. It wasn't about fame or praise. It was about impact. She had turned a humiliating moment into something that made hundreds of lives better. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at her office. It was from the police commissioner. It praised her initiative and informed her that the Listen First program would be adopted citywide. She read the letter twice, barely believing it. What had started as an embarrassing misunderstanding in a grocery store had grown into something that would shape an entire city's policing culture. That evening, she gathered her team to share the news. Everyone cheered and congratulated one another. The two officers who had been part of the original incident looked especially emotional. One of them said, "It's strange how life works, isn't it? We thought we'd ruined our careers that day, but instead it started something good." She smiled warmly. That's because growth often begins in uncomfortable moments. What matters is what we do after them. The following weekend, the department held a small event to celebrate the launch of the program. Families came, children played, and laughter filled the air. The deputy chief moved through the crowd, shaking hands, sharing smiles, and listening to stories. People who once distrusted the police now spoke openly, even warmly. It was the kind of change she had always hoped for. As the sun began to set, she stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the light fade over the rooftops. The two officers came up beside her. One of them said, "You know, I still think about that day at the store." She chuckled softly. "I do too. But I think we were all meant to be there." "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. Some lessons you can only learn by living them. That day showed all of us who we really are." They stood in silence for a moment, watching children chase each other through the grass. The air smelled of roasted food and laughter. Everything felt peaceful, almost perfect. Before she left, she took one last look at the crowd, the officers, the families, the people they served, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had come full circle. From humiliation to respect, from misunderstanding to unity, the journey had changed everyone. When she got home that night, she placed the commissioner's letter on her desk and sat by the window again, like she had so many nights before. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky. She thought about the people she had met, the teenage boy, the store manager, the officers, the strangers who now trusted them again. Every one of them was part of the story, she whispered softly. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. Then she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a moment, and let the quiet peace of the night wash over her. The rain had stopped, the sky had cleared, and somewhere out there a new day was already waiting to begin. Months after the incident at the store, the police department had transformed in ways no one had expected. The story of the deputy chief's arrest had become more than just a lesson. It had become a symbol of growth, understanding, and humanity. Officers who had once been rigid now listened more carefully. Supervisors who had been distant now engaged directly with their teams. And the community began to notice the difference, trusting the police in ways that had been rare before. One bright morning, the deputy chief arrived at the station early, as she often did. She enjoyed these quiet moments before the day fully began. The city was waking up with its usual rhythm. Cars moving, street vendors opening their stalls, children walking to school. She walked through the hallways, nodding to officers, already familiar with the now friendlier atmosphere. It felt lighter than before, almost as if the building itself had shifted. Her two officers from the shoplifting incident were waiting with a new batch of reports. They had been analyzing citizen feedback and community interactions, preparing insights for the next training session. The deputy chief took a seat looking at the documents, but she didn't rush them. Instead, she asked about their day, how they felt, what they had noticed in recent interactions. It was these small moments of genuine connection that had become her trademark. Later, a call came in from a small neighborhood market. Someone had reported a disturbance, a misunderstanding over a missing package. The deputy chief decided to accompany the officers to observe. When they arrived, they found a delivery man arguing with an elderly customer. The man insisted he had delivered the package while the customer was certain it had never arrived. Both were tense, raising their voices, emotions high. The deputy chief stepped forward calmly. She didn't reprimand or accuse. Instead, she listened to both sides, asking questions softly, giving each person time to explain. Slowly, the situation began to de-escalate. It turned out that the package had been left at a neighbor's apartment by mistake. A simple misunderstanding, but handled correctly, it became an opportunity for trust, not conflict. The elderly customer thanked the officers, shaking their hands, and the delivery man nodded gratefully. No one left feeling embarrassed or wronged. The officers looked at her, learning once again the value of patience and observation. They realized that even in small cases, the way they responded could change someone's perception of law enforcement forever. On the ride back, the deputy chief spoke quietly. Every interaction matters, no matter how small it seems. That's the heart of our work. Back at the station, she spent the afternoon reviewing plans for an expanded training program. The Listen First initiative had already been successful, and now she wanted to implement a mentorship system. Experienced officers would guide newer recruits, focusing on human understanding, empathy, and clear communication. It was designed to reduce conflicts and improve both officer and citizen experiences. The program would not just teach the rules, it would teach the reasoning behind them. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from the teenage boy she had helped at the market months ago. He had grown into a responsible young man now, and he wanted to volunteer for the community outreach events the department organized. She smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Her influence had extended beyond the officers. It had reached the lives of ordinary people who would carry forward the lessons they had learned. Weeks later, the department hosted an open community day. Families, children, and local business owners came to the station to participate in activities, ask questions, and engage with officers in a friendly environment. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the tense environment that had existed months before. The deputy chief moved through the crowd, greeting everyone, listening carefully, and taking notes for future improvements. One of the highlights of the day was a small recognition ceremony for the officers who had shown exceptional patience and empathy in recent months. The two officers who had arrested her were called forward. They were nervous, unsure what to expect, but the deputy chief smiled at them warmly. She spoke about how they had grown, about the lessons learned, and how they now embodied the ideals the department sought to uphold. The applause was heartfelt, and for the first time in a long while, the officers felt truly appreciated. That evening, as the event wound down, the deputy chief stood outside the station, looking at the people leaving. She thought about the journey from that day in the supermarket to now. So much had changed, and yet the core lesson remained simple. Understanding, patience, and human connection were the keys to effective policing. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was the store manager who had first reported her for shoplifting. He was older now, with lines on his face from worry and work. He came to apologize once again, but she waved it off gently. "No need," she said. "That day taught all of us something valuable. I am glad we could learn together." He nodded, looking relieved. "I've shared that lesson with my staff too. People need to be seen before they're judged." She smiled, realizing that the ripple effects of that one day had reached far beyond the department. Ordinary citizens, business owners, young people, and officers alike had been touched by the lesson of patience and understanding. It wasn't just a story about a mistake anymore. It was a story about growth. As she drove home that night, the streets of the city glowed softly under streetlights. The air smelled of rain and warmth from nearby bakeries. She thought about all the people she had met, the lessons she had learned, and the changes she had witnessed. Mistakes, she realized, were not failures. They were opportunities. They had the power to transform, if only handled with care and compassion. At home, she sat by her window looking at the city skyline twinkling in the darkness. Her phone buzzed again. Messages from officers, community members, and even the young man who had once been in trouble. They all shared small victories, moments where understanding had prevented conflict. It filled her with a quiet satisfaction that could not be measured in reports or statistics. She whispered softly to herself, "The hardest lessons often become the most valuable ones." She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on how far she and her team had come. The journey from misunderstanding to trust, from judgment to compassion, had reshaped the entire department. And it all began with a simple human moment, a day when she too had been seen through the eyes of ordinary people. The night grew quiet, the city humming softly below. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the calm sink in. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she knew that with patience, empathy, and understanding, the department could meet them all. And more importantly, it would continue to make a positive difference in the lives of every person they served.